Hello, everybody. My name is Langston Clark, and I am a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio, working in collaboration with Dr. Alvin Logan at Seattle University and Washington University, as well as Brandon Crooms, who right now is a doctoral student at the University of Texas at Austin, who is currently working on his dissertation. And initially, he was supposed to lead this discussion with Leah Howard, the sports counselor, but I've stepped in today because he is focused on getting that doctorate. And so it's a pleasure to be here with Leah. It's a pleasure to have you all joining us for the African Americans in Sports pod class. And so, Leah, if we could just begin, just kind of like tell us who you are and what you do and how you got into doing what it is that you do.
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Howard. I am a certified sports counselor. So I have my master's in school counseling. I'm also currently working on my PhD in counselor education and supervision. And so I got into the work that I do, not only being a former athlete myself, but just seeing that there was a need for student support. And specifically, I saw communities of color being most impacted just by accessibility to mental health services, stigma related, mistrust of the educational system and counseling processes. And so I really wanted to be that voice and that advocate because social justice plays a large role in advocating for mental health services. And so I currently serve student and professional athletes in private practice. I'm also an adjunct professor at Mercer University where I attend. So I work with some graduate students. So I kind of have the whole spread of experience. And so I really love what I do. And so that's a little bit about me.
Great. I know you had mentioned that you have sport experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that kind of helped get you to where you are in terms of being a sports counselor?
Sure. So I actually, when I was playing sports, I never thought it would lead to a career. It just kind of assisted with that aspect. But I actually attended Spelman College, number one HBCU, 13
Number
years
two
running.
HBCU. I went to A&T. I'm joking. I love Spelman too. My sister works there. Go ahead.
Oh, cool. Yeah, and so they no longer have sports, but I was the captain of the tennis team while I was there, and so they discontinued their entire athletic department. And so if you look at statistics, most D3 schools and most female student athletes, the percentages are very low for going pro. And so our
Mhm.
focus was not on being professionals, it was professional athletes. It was more on being actual career oriented professionals who were athletes. However, fast forward to my time in my master's program, I remember seeing a story about the University of Alabama Birmingham's football program being discontinued. And so ESPN covered the story. You see this group of young men crying and upset, feeling like their family is being separated, them having to, some of them looking to transfer because many of them, their goal was to become professional athletes. And so it was a huge part of their identity and who they were. And my younger cousin was actually one of the athletes, which is why I think it was a little more touching because from an administrative level, I saw similar conversations being had, and the student voices they were the loudest ones in the room, but they were probably the least impactful, which was kind of upsetting because no one asked the students, what do you all think we should do? It's kind of like decisions were just made for them. And I don't remember social supports like counseling being offered at the time. If they were, it just wasn't public. And so I was like, where's the intersectionality between sports and mental health? The percentages of Black psychologists and counselors in general only make up 3% of the career field. And so when you think about sports as a whole, we'll just take football as an
Yeah.
example. The percentages of African Americans that dominate that sport, I want to say it's 70%. The number might be larger. Check me on that. But
Mhm.
but it was like, so the services, the mental health services wouldn't even be able to service those people, or they wouldn't have enough resources to necessarily access counselors who look like them if that was a desire of theirs. And so I kind of, use that expertise in being a former athlete to kind of blend into my career path. And that's a little bit about how I got to where I was.
Fantastic. So, what's interesting, um, is that Spelman, when Spelman ended their sports programs, the way that I read it was that it was actually in the best interest of
Mm,
the campus and the
sure.
community. And I wonder if when that happened, those women who were student athletes incurred some of the the sadness. Um, I don't know if I would say trauma, but for some, it may have been traumatic because for some folks, sports is a really, really important outlet in their lives. And I wonder how that transition may have affected them when those sports programs were canceled. Were you there when the cancellation happened, or was that before?
Yeah, I was actually a junior there, yeah, and the New York Times actually interviewed me about it, so that was pretty cool to be featured, but like you said, yes, it was framed to do more of a wellness program for the entire campus because, athletics only served 80 students, and they said it was $1 million budget, but I'm always like, "But what can the students do?" Nowadays, you can fundraise, if necessary. They also talked about the women's conference was getting smaller, but even if we had to do some sort of intramural rotation, like I know we played Clark Atlanta, which may be a D1 university, but there were also four other women's colleges in the state of Georgia. So arrangements could have been made. And for tennis, at least, which was my sport, we are used to buying our own rackets, buying our own shoes. The uniforms are the only things that really stay consistent. But with the tennis courts already built, tennis, at least as if we look at each sport as a solo sport, was a very low budget potentially for the university. So
Yeah.
it just seemed like, I do remember even now there are some girls who play basketball or track or soccer who still feel some type of way. And I'm not really sure the new incoming classes, the ones who might have played sports in high school and no longer have that opportunity at the collegiate level. I'm not really sure how they feel about it. Maybe you don't miss what you never had. But it certainly didn't stop the interest in people attending the school.
What's interesting is, but I wonder how things may shift with the WNBA and the spotlight that's being put on women's sports,
Yeah.
and how there may be more support. Like if there was ever a time to have women's sports at an HBCU for women and to be able to advocate for those programs, it would be like right now. You know
Oh,
what I mean? Like that, y'all, and Spelman is not a poor school, not by any stretch of the imagination. Like
right.
I could imagine somebody writing a $5 million check for an endowment, but that's neither here nor there because it doesn't exist.
Right.
But maybe they'll start something up. I don't know.
Sure, sure. And I think we also have to just consider historically administration maybe of a certain age where women's sports was not definite. Well, we know for a fact was definitely not as evolved in the 60s, 70s, 80s when they were raised as it is now. So the priority still, yet and still, was not on athletics. But I feel like for the next upcoming generation, and even like you say now, that could definitely be a priority for something they look into for the future.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I want to talk about because you had a harsh that to me that's a harsh transition out of sport.
Oh,
When it,
yeah,
they,
it is.
they when the university imposes its own death penalty, and not because of some scandal or anything like that, just because of the budget. And I'm wondering about tell us a little bit how you were able to transition out of sport and how as a practitioner you maybe help people deal with their transition out of sport.
Oh, sure. And we're seeing that so much now, just of course with COVID and how different universities handled that transition process and having sports available and some chose not to this past season. And so I think for me, my transition, it was shocking. It was kind of one of those, okay, this is no longer in my control. But I think I was always setting the steps in motion to prepare to make that transition in one more year regardless. And so it was a little sooner than I had hoped for, but I think mentally I was preparing anyway. And not all people really have those steps and preparations. And so what I do with helping athletes transition, it really depends on the athlete, right? It depends on where they are and what their potential goals are. Because if we're talking about pro athletes, sometimes there's not always typically a plan B. It's this is my plan A. And if I don't give it all of my attention and all of my energy, focusing on something else means I'm no longer focusing on being the best pro athlete I can. And so you have to approach it sensitively, but also as they're ready. And so student athletes who know graduation is coming up kind of see big picture. And so that's a little bit easier, but you just start with the building blocks of, okay, what do you see for your future? And then kind of work towards that, like short term goals versus long term goals, and then building upon that. And then also, um, just the emotional resilience that comes with it. You kind of have to do a temperature check of where people are in terms of realistically meeting those goals and being prepared once sports is over for them.
I kind of, I wrestle with um, the narrow focus that in my interactions I've had with student athletes where I work, where their focus is very much on sports,
Yeah,
and it's mostly the men, and it's mostly basketball and football, and I would say football in particular,
sure.
where there's a lot of pressure to be a football player.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much that narrow focus comes from an internal place as much as an external place. I remember I had a student athlete a few years ago tell me that he was like, Dr. Clark, you don't understand. Like, my family expects me to play football. Like, I have these concussions and stuff and all of this, but mom, dad, cousins, uncle, auntie, they all want me to play sports. And I'm wondering, and not to mention coaches, the pressure that coaches put on
Sure.
student athletes. I'm wondering um, how you have those conversations with student athletes or just in athletes in general with the external expectations for you to have this identity as an athlete.
That's a really good question because, like you said, it's more of a both and. So
Mhm.
it could be both external and internal motivations. There's so many reasons why people feel that pressure, whether it's financial obligations, whether it's that's all they know, and sometimes sports is, one of the fastest ways to get out of certain financial situations, but and I kind of struggle with the idea of presenting players with those statistics like, oh,
Mhm.
only 1% of
Yeah.
players go pro, because at the same time, there is still a large number of players who do go pro, and um, you never want to discourage anyone's dreams. But I think what's been really helpful. So one of the therapies that I really like to prioritize and work with athletes is called narrative therapy, and
Mm.
that means like telling one story or using storytelling to identify behaviors or undesirable behaviors or actions, and in order to change them for the future. And so things that really work with athletes, like seeing another athlete story. Okay, this was a success story, or this was somebody who went through a couple hurdles or trials and tribulations, and this is how they prevailed or didn't. And what can we learn from this situation? So then, therefore, it takes it out of being so personalized to the athlete, and they can see someone else in those shoes. And I think now, we see like the I Am Athlete podcast. We see so many different professional athletes now speaking up about their experiences, and it empowers and encourages other athletes to feel the same. And I think they also start to make the expectations they have for themselves a little lessened. But I think helping with storytelling really makes a big difference with that.
That's interesting. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I also think based upon what you described, the lessening of maybe the sport expectations, but there's also like a raising of the expectations or the ability to see yourself in other ways in other professions
Sure.
um, is really interesting. I hope I remember this name right. The brother who just bought Ebony magazine. Um, he, I'm gonna get his name wrong. I think it's Junior Bridgman. I could be wrong, but anyways, he wasn't like a superstar basketball player. Had
Mhm.
a decent career, made some investments, bought some um, fast food restaurants, and has like a portfolio of businesses like hundreds of millions of dollars. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think sometimes like we see the LeBron James, the Serena Williams, and those pinnacle athletes, but we don't
Sure.
see the mediocre athlete who is super successful in a number of other ways at the top of their profession post sport, but they're still like that dominant sort of figure in their field. It's just not on the field. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I think it's so important, those people that work with athletes, counselors or not, it's important to introduce these stories and examples to student athletes to say, hey, look, this person found out what their gifts and talents were, and maybe they weren't the best player on the team, but they made sure that their life outside of sport set them up very nicely. And these seem to be the steps they can take. And one thing that I guess I not really surprised about, but I encourage people reach out. Some people are more accessible than you think. I mean, some people are just waiting to take on mentors and mentees and really looking to help young and up and coming people. And so sometimes these stories that you hear about, some of the people involved in them are very accessible.
Yeah. We found that out with you because I think Brandon just reached out to you to get you to do the podcast. So this episode is evidence of that. I want to take us back just a little bit, and I want to have you talk to us a little bit more about the field of sports counseling,
Okay.
because I think it's important to distinguish between counseling and sports counseling, and it may even help me because I know that I've tried to encourage some students, right, who aren't student athletes, but then some students who are also athletes to
Okay.
seek counseling and kind of tell us why sports counseling. What is the difference between sports counseling and just counseling in general, and why might those two things, those differences, be necessary for people who are student athletes or just athletes in general?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question too, because sports counseling is kind of a branch off of regular counseling. However, it prioritizes the athlete and certain experiences that come with being athletes, whether it's injury related depression, whether it's adjustment and transition, whether it is societal pressures. I mean, a lot comes with being an athlete. And so it really just focuses in on specific needs that you see in the athlete community. And so it incorporates a lot of counseling theory and practice. And so general counseling, it's almost like, I guess the training would just be different. It's almost like marriage and family therapists. They focus on
Mhm.
family units and family dynamics and understanding certain situations that are commonly seen with marriages and families. Same thing goes with sports counseling. What are some common issues that are seen in the athlete community, whether from youth sports all the way up to professional sports? And so you'll start to see common patterns. And so it's not necessary that an athlete has to go see a sports counselor to get what they need, because at the end of the day, they are still humans with human concerns and issues that come up. And so somebody who is not trained as a sports counselor may still be very much capable. However, I think the trainings are becoming more prevalent for the counselors. And one thing I'm seeing with sports counseling in general, so in 2018 and 2019, the NCAA, the NFL, the NBA all decided to have a sports professional on their staff, full time or part time. And so it's still a very new and growing field. And I think from a systemic level, people are still learning how to incorporate it and what exactly those services look like. But I think also from the counseling side, people are learning, okay, the athlete population is expressing these needs. How can we best serve them?
It's interesting that you say the athlete population is expressing these needs, but may not be expressing them and saying, I need a sports counselor. You know
Right.
what I mean? And I think I'm asking this because, I've had student athletes who have um, had traumatic experiences, um, witnessing deaths. It could be stuff that happened in childhood. It could just
Yeah.
be people in my family sick from COVID right now. And they have particular needs that are different from the typical student who's not an athlete.
Right.
I'm wondering, how do we get athletic programs, and I would say even like high school, I'm in Texas, so I'm gonna say middle school through
Yeah,
college, to
absolutely.
recognize that the students are expressing this need, even though they're not saying I need a counselor, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think continuing to have those conversations. And what I've noticed, I mean, even just with now, I'm seeing university athletic departments have their own counseling centers, kind of in a triage of sorts. You might have a director of counseling and sports psychology. You might have a sports psychologist and also a counselor, and kind
Mm,
of like this team to address all of the mental health needs. And so that's slowly starting to become a thing. Why hasn't it really been in the past? I don't know. But the athletes really seem to be the driving force for getting more resources. And so, as uncomfortable as it is, I always encourage people to speak up, because if you don't say anything, nobody will really know what's happening. And like you said, a lot of students are, or people in general are going through a lot of stuff, and that they have yet to unpack from childhood. And with the athlete population and community, time management is a huge factor. I mean, sports and practice and travel games, that takes up so much time, that we also have to consider having counseling resources available at the times that work for athletes. And
yeah.
so it's not an overnight quick fix, but those are just also considerations that come with serving athletes.
So so much of have you've been to the Black Student Athlete Summit, right?
Yep, I
Okay,
presented there in 2019.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Because I
Yeah,
thought you looked familiar, and I thought that
okay,
Brandon had brought that up, that that's where he had
okay.
first encountered your work. And I don't know if you said your first time was 2019.
Yep.
So you know Dr. Moore.
Uh-huh.
He kind of like the face of the Black Student Athlete Summit. And I don't know if he said this while you were there, but he had mentioned that like coaches can be crazy. And I don't mean that to disparage people with mental health issues. Let me be clear about that. But in terms of the amount of hours put in, the pressure put on themselves, time spent away from families, and I'm wondering how, um, what type do coaches need a specific type of like sports counseling as well, and how do you get coaches integrated into that sort of like counseling that they need as well, because they're still in the sport environment, you know?
Mhm, mhm. That's such a great point. I'm actually kind of working on developing some sort of curriculum for coaches specifically. Right now, I have an athlete mental wellness certificate that's available, but I'm including coaches in that as kind of a bonus. But I'm thinking, I've seen the same thing you just said. Coaches have so much pressure put on them, and it's different. And so I definitely think their needs need to be addressed. I also a past couple weeks I had somebody reach out to me asking if there were specific branches of sports counseling for referees as well. And so
Mm,
now we're starting to think of this whole conglomerate and ecosystem of athletics, and how do we serve each of these roles. And so I think that's such a great point. um, I don't know that right now there's specific things that serve coaches. I do know that the best schools bring coaches in as part of the wellness program, so that coaches know exactly what services are available. Now, counselors, because the information is confidential, we cannot share everything that
yeah,
happens with the student athletes that they serve. However, bringing them in as part of that wellness consultative um, kind of group meeting is really important.
yeah. I One of the things I think people don't realize is that if you're a lawyer, okay, if you're a lawyer and you lose a trial, unless it's the OJ trial, no one knows that you lost your trial.
Sure,
You
sure,
know what I mean? If
sure.
you're an athlete, if you're a coach, and you go 1 in 10, those losses are public. It's in the news, it's on TV. Everybody knows that you're doing a bad job. If you're a referee and you miss the call, an
Mhm.
important call, a game deciding call, your name is trending on ESPN, and the refs are supposed to be non-existent. Like
Sure.
when you're doing a good job as a ref when no one knows who you are. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think the public in general lacks a lot of empathy for the types of pressure that are put on people in the athletic realm in general. You could be the athletic director, and if things are going to hell, like,
Mhm.
everyone's going to be coming on you if there's a scandal. So I think it's important that throughout the sports industrial complex, that counseling be like a permanent fixture within that industry.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things that I want to kind of talk about is the type of trauma that people get from sports.
Mhm.
Um, and I bring this up because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a former D1 student athlete,
Okay.
talking about from high school to college. In high school, I think it was a mostly Black high school. They had a white football coach. They like won championships. They were super successful program,
Mhm.
but the coach was just abusive. Like, you dumb bastard, you this, you that, cussing them out, just tearing them down. And in some ways, that gets normalized in sport. But then he also talked about how in college, he saw a head football coach choke a long snapper. And I
Mhm.
was like, that coach did that? And because to me, that coach seemed like one of those nerdy, nice guy type coaches. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But it was just, I was surprised. And I think we don't understand, I think athletes don't understand that. I think sometimes athletes don't understand that what is happening to them in the sporting environment outside of any other context would be deemed it's completely abnormal. And so how do we get to um, servicing or protecting student athletes from um, incurring that type of trauma in their sport environment?
Mhm. I think that is such a great point, because it is more common than we think, and oftentimes we don't hear about it until it's too late, or somebody is ready and prepared to transfer. And so I think having those discussions, for one, with coaches, absolutely from the beginning, they should not be able to feel like verbal and physical or mental abuse is appropriate on any terms, but teaching them ways to be just as effective by using different tactics. I think that should be a huge part in
Mm,
coaching training programs. And then also, um, I personally feel like there should be some sort of anonymous method for student athletes to communicate, even with administration. Maybe you don't feel comfortable coming forward as a student athlete about everything that's going on, but sometimes when people know that their scholarships are on the line, or that their positioning on the team could be at risk, they're of course going to be less likely to speak up. And we're talking about young people, who are very much still growing and developing as adults. I mean, the human brain doesn't even fully develop until 25. And so I think having some sort of method and trust building from the administrative level down may be able to assist with some of those challenges. But absolutely.
um, so are you familiar with Jordan Peterson?
Remind me.
That book, 12 Rules for Life.
Oh,
He,
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, he's somewhat controversial. He's a controversial white man who is not a social justice advocate by any stretch of the imagination. Um, can be very critical of ethnic studies, I
Mhm.
would say. But there are some things that he talks about that I think about as valid from like a strict sort of like psychological standpoint in terms of what does it mean for an individual in terms of their mental health to be someone who stands up for themselves.
Mhm.
And I wrestle with um, I wrestle with how we get athletes or just people in general to understand psychologically what it means to not allow someone to treat you that way to begin with, but also
Mhm.
understanding that like it's not your fault if someone is. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I'm wrestling with not blaming the victim, but also sort of like communicating that, you know, you are a person, you have dignity, you have value. And because of that, don't allow someone to treat you as if you don't, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about normalizing cutting toxic cycles, because unfortunately, sometimes people who tolerate that sort of abuse, that's what they know to be normal. And so then they continue to accept it. And like you said, dignity is something that all humans are deserving of. And, I like to encourage people not to just prioritize their mental health or speak to somebody when there's a problem happening, but almost having like mental maintenance, because
Mhm.
even mental health is something that's on a continuum, and even the most solid people can have days in which it may be on the decline.
Yeah.
And unless you are monitoring it, it may be to a point where it impacts your functioning, and then therefore it impacts your decision making, and therefore you're more likely to be tolerant of certain things and actions and behaviors that you otherwise wouldn't. And so I think working on building that support network very early on can hopefully help subside, because sometimes you need somebody to say, why are you tolerating this? You
Mm.
know, and calling you out on your own behaviors of what you're accepting.
I almost wonder, and I don't know if you've thought about this, but is there such a thing as like group counseling at the team level?
I think that there is. I think those that work within athletic departments, they do offer that. There are pros and cons.
Mhm.
Just because with group counseling, and I do group counseling with graduate students
Mm.
at the university. So there are concerns with confidentiality. Um,
Mhm.
I think the best groups are usually maybe 6 to 8 people, but sometimes in order to serve populations, universities push for the groups to be a little bit larger than that. And at the end of the day, these are people you go to school with.
Yeah.
And so keeping that confidentiality piece is kind of difficult,
Yeah.
but it can be very, very effective, because the one thing that makes group counseling the most effective is that you can see other, like you're not alone. You don't feel alone. You can see others who are
Mm.
experiencing something just as similar as you.
Mm.
So and so those are, I mean, I love group counseling. I think it's a great method of serving students, especially if they don't have that much individualized time.
Yeah.
But it's, does the counselor have the right training and expertise to handle it appropriately, set those ground rules early on, shut down people who may be may have different intentions in coming and being in the group,
Yeah.
because any sort of group will always have different dynamics. You'll
Mm.
have those people who speak up a little more and those who speak up a little less, or those who might try to overtake the group. And so the best group leader can manage and dissect all of that stuff. And so, yes, those services are available. But, one of the reasons I wanted to get my doctorate is so I could impact counselor training programs. My speech was actually on comprehensive counseling programs
Mm.
at Black Student Athlete Summit. And so I am that person who is concerned. Are these counselors ready and prepared to work with student athletes on all levels?
So yeah, and I know that you talk a little bit more about that, but then also talk about, and you mentioned it before, that there's a lack of counselors who are Black, right? And
Mm-hmm.
even if we had counseling services in athletic programs, whether they be high school, middle school, college, or professional, there wouldn't be enough of us to serve our population. So tell me about how you see us getting more Black folk into the counseling field.
Sure. So the research shows that the relationship is the biggest component. I remember reading this study. Um, I think it's by Lopez and Lopez. I can't remember the name of it. However, it was looking at student athlete barriers to seeking counseling, and they broke it down in terms of race. They broke it down in terms of age, gender, and if the person was also familiar with sports. And so the thing that the student athletes prioritized the most, they just wanted somebody who was familiar with sports and trained appropriately as a counselor. Race was not a concern. I mean, it could have been, a preference, but it wasn't one of the number one things that prevented
Mm,
students from going. So, if you are a student or you do work at a university where you may not be able to access a counselor who looks just like you, don't automatically shut it down. However, we also know that on the flip side of that, there are certain relational connections that can happen when a person does have a similar background to you or can relate on certain things such as ethnicity and race and culture. And so I think it's so important, you asked about getting us in these spaces. I think it's important to know that we can, and I think it's important that we are provided with those opportunities, but when we are, we have to be ready.
yeah,
We have to be prepared and know exactly what it is we are talking about. And in most cases we do, but sometimes that lack of confidence is there, just because we're unsure, do we belong in this space? Do we
yeah.
fit here? Can we serve this need? And so um I think seeing more people doing your research. When I first was interested in the field of blending sports and mental health, I'm like, let me do my research. Let me reach out to some people. And one of the first people that came up, her name is Dr. Kinza Gunter.
Mhm.
This was a couple years ago, but she was a Black woman. And for me, that was inspiring because I'm like, wow, someone who looks like me is doing this. And that shows me that it is possible. And having those conversations. I think another thing in terms of getting us in these spaces is us not being afraid to share resources.
Yeah.
It's like you are still you. And if something is destined for you, it's going to be yours. But I think in terms of helping people and uplifting each other, we have to be willing to, provide that support.
I think it's great that you brought up that you found another Black woman who was in your field to kind of be an archetype or a mentor
Sure.
for you in your journey. And one of the things that I don't want to miss before we end the conversation is that if we look at the numbers, right, particularly where I'm a professor, the Black women at UTSA, historically, and I say historically, probably last 5 to 10 years or so, it may not be
Yeah,
this year,
sure.
have the highest graduation rate
Hmm.
of, and this is a Hispanic serving institution, so the Black population is relatively small. There's not a lot of Black faculty there. There's a lot of Black staff who do a lot of the good work to support the students, but the Black women are actually crushing it academically. And I think the same is more true, just generally speaking. I don't know about UTSA specifically, for Black women who are student athletes when we think about academically and their
Oh
transition
yeah.
out of sport.
Oh yeah.
And we sometimes think that like, oh, the sisters are doing well, but like there are particular things that Black women need too in terms of counseling that maybe get overshadowed by the Black men who are in the sports that sort of dominate the attention, that get the most money. And so could you talk about a little bit about the needs of Black women in athletics in terms of the counseling and support that they need, particular to the circumstances that they may be in?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Now you're getting deep into it. And honestly, that could be a whole conversation.
Mm,
But Black women in general, yes, they are, if you're looking at the numbers, they are I think last I checked, the most educated group in America as far
yeah.
as their percentages of graduates. However, in terms of the respect factors, in terms of the self-awareness piece is a really big factor. I think also confidence building is something I see with a lot of Black women um, that I work with. I think also just kind of learning how to adapt is not a problem they experience, but it's more so their environments that they go into adapting to them.
Mm,
Am
yeah.
I having to change who I am? Am I having to code switch? Am I having to have my hair a certain way? And all that plays into is my alignment with myself being true to who I am, and
Mm,
how much does that impact me emotionally if I don't feel like my alignment with who I show the world is truly who I am, just based on cultural appropriateness in the workplace.
yeah,
And so I think those are all certain things to keep in mind. And unfortunately, it's kind of like a I don't know that a white male psychologist would be able to understand each of the threading, each of the complexities that come with being a black female. I
yeah.
mean, because you can read books all day long, but you won't know what being a black person or a black woman is like. And like I said, this could be a deeper conversation, but if we're also talking in terms of sexuality and transgender and transitioning and what that means to be a woman. I mean, there's so many layers. And so yeah, I think especially, it's not even the times that we are now, because discrimination has been
Yeah.
huge in the past, but it's now, I guess, being brought to light via social media as well. And so it's kind of intertwined in all that you do, and being aware of who you are is becoming even more at the forefront of your identity. And so I think those are just some things to keep in mind for sure. And I think also black women are less inclined to, um I guess, less inclined to seek help and speak up about their issues.
Mm,
We say in terms of black men, like, black men are masculine and they hide their feelings, but I've seen just as many men in counseling as women. But I think women are so used to handling it on their own, and being the high achievers that they are, they're like, well, I don't really need help, because seeking help means that I'm no longer handling things in the way
mm,
that I once
yeah,
was.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and I think in some ways people have said that it plays into the how the strong black woman trope can be toxic
Sure.
because it keeps people from getting the support that they need, right? And so I think some ways like strength is supposed to be something that's maybe not an individual thing, but strength is a collective thing, and recognizing that like sometimes you need a spotter in the gym, sometimes
Oh
somebody
yeah.
spot you, you know? So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And these are just generalizations, they don't apply to every single person. Each case is different, but yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do, but I am seeing that, in the difference between my generation and my parents' generation, I am seeing the stigma in mental health decrease. But now if you talk to the wrong person and express to them that you are considering getting therapy or counseling, they may say, "Oh, are you sure? I don't think you need that." But it really just depends on where they are in their own journeys as well.
and I think what's interesting is that I think the worst case scenario, if you decide to go to counseling for whatever issue, but let's say you maybe don't need counseling for that issue, you may go to counseling and find help with some issues that you didn't realize that you had. It's like saying, I don't need to go get my checkup because I'm not sick. Well, you're supposed to go get your checkup to prevent yourself from being sick too. Right. And
Absolutely.
I think sometimes we don't frame it that way. And I've almost started thinking to myself, like, do I need to get a mental health checkup at least once a year? At least, just like I go to the dentist twice a year, I get
Yeah.
my physical once a year, you know?
Yeah. And just to have somebody on call for those moments. Another common thing in the Black community, we've always been, and this is just a generalization, prioritized religion as a method of healing.
Yeah.
And you really can have both. You can have Jesus in combination with therapy. And honestly, that's like having a team working your best interest. And
Yeah.
so, creating that wellness team, I think is so important. And so, absolutely. I mean, I encourage people to go and unpack those things that maybe they didn't even know they needed to.
Yeah. That was, ooh, I'm gonna steal that. And you don't even know it. That having your wellness team, because I've heard this speech not a million times, but maybe a couple thousand times. Like you need a board of directors in your life, right? A personal board of directors. But I think it's interesting moving forward that, some of the conversations that I'll have with students is that you need a wellness team. And your wellness team may be different from your board of directors. Your wellness team could be your dentist. It could be your physician. It could be your mental health counselor. It could be your spiritual confidant. Just to deal with it could be your personal trainer, right? The person you work out with, like who's on your wellness team. And that's, I think, is something that we need to communicate to athletes and students as they make their transition out of these environments. Because it's easy, like, when you work at a university, there's a workout center at school, right? There's a mental health counseling that's there for the students and hopefully there for the student athletes too. And it's easily accessible, but maybe one of the things that we don't do well is equip students to get those services once they leave.
Absolutely.
So we have about 12 minutes left. And so I'm gonna ask two questions if we can get to them.
Okay.
And one of them is, how do you loving something that doesn't love you back?
Mm-hmm.
Because sports, people say, I love sports. I love football. I love basketball. I love track. I love rugby. I love beer pong, whatever.
Yeah.
But sport is not a person, and it cannot love you back. And so I'm wondering, is there a mentality shift, mental health sort of positioning that athletes, maybe even non-athletes, need to take in terms of realizing that sports is incapable of loving you back? And how maybe should that shape your relationship to those types of activities?
So that's an interesting point. I don't even know if I would frame it as, well, just thinking as a
Mhm.
counselor, I don't know that I would frame it as sports doesn't love you back, because we do see a lot of reward in it,
Yeah,
right? We see team bonding experiences, we see physical health, but I would say sports is not a replacement for therapy.
mm,
Even though that exercise releases endorphins, it shows that you can reduce your aging process slightly, and your brain development is healthier the more you exercise. However, I think so many people use that as a release and outlet, but it is still not a replacement for therapy and
yeah,
talking about and expressing some of the feelings that you're having. And so I think understanding the relationship one has with sports is understanding the role that it plays in your life, but also knowing that it's not a substitute for
right,
other things as
right.
well.
That's good. I
Mhm.
was maybe a little too critical of
No,
sport.
that's
I was,
okay.
I was, I maybe a little too critical of sport. Um, and so because this is a African Americans in Sport pod class,
Sure.
what advice could you give to college students as they look to make their transition out of school, whether they be student athletes or non-student athletes?
Sure. One thing that I would say is to actually write your goals down.
Mhm.
It's easy to have them in our head and, oh, okay, when I graduate, I want to do this, or this is the school I'm looking into. But actually come up with a plan. You don't even have to share it with anybody else. One activity that I encourage people to do, and that people, if they're listening to this podcast, can take away, develop and create a vision board. And a vision board could consist of magazine article clippings, or pictures of yourself, or pictures of future jobs and aspirations that you want to have. And you could section it in terms of career development, emotional wellness and fitness, any sorts of goals that you have, but getting it down and putting it somewhere you can see every day, and also being willing to be flexible with that list. Like, be determined in your goals, but also be flexible in the methods for getting there, because there is no one size fits all. There is no one way to do things. And then also just do your research. And if you have an idea, there's typically someone else who has a similar idea. And so looking for opportunities for collaboration, but and like I mentioned earlier, finding someone like you in certain spaces. That person may not be accessible, but it shouldn't hurt your feelings if you can't reach them. But use their story and gather as much information as you can about them, to look to that as a model and a blueprint, and then make it your own thing. And so that's the advice I would give people to help with that transition out of school because it's not an easy one, but you're not the first one to do it. And so you just, it's not going to be a seamless process, but it could be made easier with preparation for sure.
Yeah. Um, Future Dr. Howard, thank you for joining us here today for this conversation about mental health and athletics and student athletes. Before we go, are there any places where people can follow you on social media? Do you have a website so they can find out a little bit more about what they do? Share that type of information with us if you could.
Oh, sure. I'm on Instagram as the sports counselor. They can also reach me at my website, thesportscounselor.com. And then I have a book coming out, hopefully within the next month or two, called Making It Happen. I'll definitely post that information on my website once it becomes available. So, yeah, feel free to reach out to me anytime. Usually, I have a lot of projects going on. I actually have recently opened up an internship. And so I have a couple students working with me, but I plan to continue kind of that process, and some of them are even publishing with me. So, stay in touch and yeah, yeah.
All right. Dr. Howard, future Dr. Howard, thank you for joining us and giving your insights and your wisdom to mental health and Black athletes.
Thank you.